My name is Audrey. I'm 32 years old and until 8 months ago, I thought I knew exactly what my life looked like. I had a husband I loved, a house we'd picked out together, and a routine so steady I could navigate it with my eyes closed. I knew which side of the bed he slept on. I knew how he took his coffee. I knew the sound of his footsteps coming down the hallway at night. I thought I knew everything. I didn't know anything at all. It started on a Tuesday. I remember because I had just gotten home from a double shift at the hospital. I work as a radiology technician, and my feet were aching, and all I wanted was a shower and maybe half an episode of something forgettable on TV. My husband, Elliot, had been traveling for work the week before, a consulting project in Portland. But he'd come home that Sunday. We'd barely had time to catch up. That Tuesday evening, he was sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop open, and I leaned over and kissed the top of his head, and he reached up and squeezed my hand without looking away from the screen. Completely normal. Completely ordinary. I showered. I made toast. I sat down on the couch next to him when he finally closed the laptop, and we watched TV for about an hour before I fell asleep against his shoulder. I remember thinking, right before I drifted off, that this was enough, that this quiet, unremarkable evening was everything. I woke up at 2 a.m. to my phone ringing. It was my younger sister. She's a nurse at St. Callaway Medical Center, about 20 minutes from our house, and she almost never calls that late unless it's serious. I answered half asleep, thinking something had happened to our mother. Her voice was strange, controlled in the way that nurses learn to be controlled when they're delivering news they don't want to deliver. She said, "Audrey, I need you to come to the hospital. Elliot is here. He was in an accident." I laughed. I actually laughed, because Elliot was right there. I could feel the warmth of him still beside me on the couch, could hear the soft sound of the television still running low in the background. "That's not possible," I told her. "He's here. He's sitting right next to me." She went quiet for just a second. Then she said, very carefully, "Audrey, please come. I'm looking at his ID right now." I sat up. I looked at Elliot. He was watching me, expression unreadable in the dark. "My sister thinks you were at the hospital," I said, almost like a joke. He tilted his head, reached over and touched my knee lightly. "That's strange," he said. "Someone must have had his wallet. Identity mix-ups happen, especially in emergencies. You should probably go just to sort it out." Something small and cold moved through me. Not alarm exactly, more like a tiny stone dropping into still water. I told myself it was just the 2 a.m. strangeness of being half awake. I grabbed my jacket and drove to the hospital alone. I want to explain something about that night because I know what some people would say. Why did you leave? Why did you bring him with you? And the honest answer is that I didn't feel afraid. I felt confused. There's a difference. Fear would have sharpened everything. Confusion just made the edges soft and strange. And I kept telling myself there was a rational explanation waiting for me at the other end of that drive. My sister met me at the emergency entrance. She was still in her scrubs. Her face did something complicated when she saw me. She took me to a room on the 3rd floor without saying much. A doctor was waiting outside. He introduced himself, confirmed my name, confirmed Elliot's name and description. Then he opened the door and I walked in. The man in the bed looked exactly like my husband. I mean, exactly. Same nose, same jaw, same long fingers resting against the hospital blanket. There was a scar on his left forearm from a cycling accident Elliot had had years before we met. He told me the story on our second date. I knew that scar. I had touched that scar 100 times. My legs went strange under me. I put my hand on the doorframe. The doctor said he had been found unresponsive at the bottom of a stairwell in a parking garage downtown. Head trauma. Internal bleeding. He had been in surgery for 4 hours. He was stable now, but still unconscious. I stood at the side of the bed for a long time. Then I drove home. I know that sounds impossible, too. I know it sounds like the wrong thing to do. But I want you to understand the particular kind of paralysis that comes with witnessing something your mind simply refuses to process. It wasn't that I didn't believe what I'd seen. It was that I couldn't fit it into any framework that made sense. I had a husband at home. There was a man in the hospital with my husband's face, and my husband's scar, and my husband's hospital ID bracelet. Both things were true. I couldn't make them coexist. Elliot was awake when I got back. He was in the kitchen, making tea. He looked up when I came in, and there was something in his eyes. Concern, attentiveness, a kind of careful watchfulness that I registered for half a second and then let go of, because what was I supposed to do with it? He listened while I told him what I'd seen. He nodded slowly. He said the most logical explanation was that someone had stolen his wallet, probably when he was in Portland, and that person had been in the accident. He said we should call the police in the morning. He was calm and reasonable, and he made me chamomile tea and sat with me on the couch until I stopped shaking. And then he said, very gently, "You've been working too hard. Try not to let this spiral. We'll figure it out tomorrow." I told myself he was right. In the days that followed, I visited the hospital twice, both times without telling Elliot. I told myself I was going to check on the unknown man's condition. That was all. That I was being responsible. The hospital staff knew me as Elliot's wife by then, so they updated me without question. He remained unconscious. The police had been notified. There were no hits on missing persons matching his description. I stood at his bedside and steadied his face until the nurse gently suggested I get some rest. At home, I watched Elliot. I want to be careful about how I describe this because it wasn't dramatic. It was small. It was the kind of thing you notice and immediately second guess. He paused half a second too long before answering a question about a restaurant we'd been to on our anniversary. He reached for the wrong cabinet when looking for the mugs. Once, in the middle of a conversation, he called me honey, and Elliot had never called me honey in the 6 years we'd been together. He called me odd. Always odd. But every time I noticed something like that, he'd do something else. Something intimate and specific that dissolved my doubt completely. He knew about the inside joke we'd had about a broken ceiling fan in our first apartment. He knew that I always kicked off my left shoe before my right. He knew exactly how I liked my eggs. It is a particular kind of horror I've since come to understand, to suspect something you cannot name and have no evidence for, while the person you suspect keeps being kind to you. 3 weeks passed. Then my sister called again. She asked me to meet her at the hospital, not in a patient room this time, in her office. She closed the door behind me and sat across from me at her desk with her hands folded in front of her in that careful way she has, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. "I've been doing some digging," she said, "because I couldn't stop thinking about the night you called and said Elliot was sitting right next to you, and I found something. I don't know what it means yet, but I think you need to know." She turned her laptop toward me. She had been going through the man's personal effects, which had been bagged and logged by hospital staff. His phone had been destroyed in the fall, but there was a slim wallet. Inside was Elliot's driver's license, Elliot's insurance card, but there was also something else. Tucked behind a hidden panel at the back of the wallet, a card from a private medical clinic in Nevada, and a handwritten appointment note with a date from 14 months ago. My sister had called the clinic. She hadn't identified herself as a nurse, just a concerned family member. They wouldn't confirm or deny anything, but she'd found the clinic's name in a database of facilities that specialize in reconstructive and cosmetic surgery, with a note indicating they offered advanced facial identity procedures. My hands had gone cold. She kept going. Through the hospital's records, she had access to comparative imaging because both men had been scanned at St. Callaway. She had noticed a discrepancy. Bone structure around the orbital ridge. Subtle. The kind of thing you'd only catch if you were specifically looking. The unconscious man had minor scarring consistent with surgical intervention around the jaw and cheekbones. Recent. Within the last year or two. Someone had surgically altered their face to look like my husband. I think I sat in her office for close to an hour after she finished talking. I couldn't cry. I couldn't really speak. I just kept going back through every moment of the past 3 weeks, every meal, every conversation, every night, and feeling the floor tilt under me. She asked me if I had any idea who would do something like this. And that's when a name surfaced that I'd been keeping underwater without even realizing it. Elliot had a friend, someone he'd known since college. They drifted somewhat in the years after graduation, but had reconnected about 2 years ago, not long before the incidents had presumably begun. His name was Scott. Scott Vander? I met him a handful of times at group dinners and one backyard barbecue. He'd always been polite to me, attentive in a way that, looking back, sat slightly wrong, the kind of attention that doesn't quite relax when you turn away from it. I also remembered something Elliot had mentioned, almost in passing, about 8 months before all of this, that Scott had gone through a bad breakup and had been acting strangely, calling too often, sending long emails. Elliot had been gentle about it, the way he always was. He hadn't wanted to cut Scott off completely. He'd just started creating a little distance. That detail had seemed minor at the time. I drove home that night with my sister's research notes on my phone and a feeling in my chest like standing at the edge of something very high. The man in my house was Scott. I was almost certain of it now. And I had been living with him for 3 weeks. He had been sleeping in my home, eating at my table, asking how my day had been. He had been studying my life and replaying it back to me. And Elliot, my real husband, was unconscious in a hospital bed because Scott had put him there. The accident had not been an accident. I didn't confront him. I want to be clear about that. Every instinct I had said that confrontation was the wrong move, not because I was afraid of him, though I probably should have been, but because I understood something. I needed more than my sister's medical observations and a clinic card. I needed something that would hold up, something undeniable. So I went home and I made dinner and I smiled across the table and I asked about his day. And while he slept, I went through his things. It took 3 nights. I was methodical. I went through the pockets of every jacket in the closet, through the locked box in the back of the top shelf that I'd always assumed held Elliot's old work documents, through the browsing history on the tablet he thought I didn't use. I found a burner phone tucked into a rolled pair of socks in the back of a dresser drawer. The texts on it were mostly deleted, but a handful remained. They were from an unknown number. They referenced logistics, timing, scheduling, a payment. There were no names, but there was a date, 3 days before the accident. I photographed everything. I contacted a private attorney, separately from any lawyer Elliot and I had ever used together. I explained the situation. She helped me understand what I was dealing with legally and what kind of documentation would matter. I need to explain something else, because it is important and because it is the part that took me the longest to understand. Elliot and I had recently consolidated our financial accounts and updated our estate documents. It was something we'd been meaning to do for years, and we'd finally gotten around to it about 4 months before the accident. The timing, I now realized, had not been coincidental. Scott had known. Somewhere along the way, through those long emails, through the renewed friendship, he had learned enough about our financial situation to know that being Elliot legally meant having access to assets worth more than $1 million. He hadn't just wanted my husband's face. He had wanted everything. About a week after I found the burner phone, he brought up the estate documents at dinner. Casually, like it was something that had just occurred to him, he said he thought we should finally finish setting up the trust structure, that it would be good to have everything in order. He said he'd already called the attorney we'd used before and scheduled a meeting for the following Thursday. I said that sounded like a good idea. I spent the next 5 days working with my attorney and my sister and a private investigator she recommended. Between the clinic card, the surgical imaging comparisons, the burner phone records, the timeline of Scott's visits to Elliot in Portland cross-referenced with the accident date, and a statement from a former colleague of Scott's who confirmed he had taken a leave of absence for a medical procedure 14 months ago, we had what we needed. I also did something I am both proud of and, even now, slightly unsettled by. I went to the hospital one afternoon while Scott thought I was at work. I held Elliot's hand and I talked to him for a long time. I told him what had happened. I told him I was going to fix it. The doctor said he had been showing signs of increased brain activity, that he might be closer to consciousness than they had thought. I asked him, very quietly, if he could hear me. His fingers tightened around mine for just a second. I drove straight to the attorney's office and finalized everything. On Thursday, I walked into that meeting looking exactly the same as I had every evening for the past several weeks. Calm, pleasant, a little tired from work. The conference room had a large screen on one wall. Scott sat to my left, the attorney across from us, the documents laid out in a neat stack. The attorney slid the papers toward me first. I looked at them for a long moment. Then I said, "Before we start, I want to show you something." I had already spoken to the attorney ahead of time. She had been fully briefed. The screen behind us came on. The first image was a photograph of the clinic card found in the wallet. The second was the medical imaging comparison, annotated by a forensic radiologist. The third was a screenshot of the burner phone texts. Scott went very still beside me. "I know who you are," I said. I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "I know what you did to my husband, and I know why you did it." He stood up. He started talking, quickly, in that controlled, reasonable tone I had come to recognize, but the door behind him opened before he got very far. 2 detectives walked in, along with an officer from the fraud division. My attorney had coordinated the timing carefully. I watched his face in that moment, the face that had been designed in a clinic in Nevada to replace the face I loved, and I watched something in it collapse. The careful construction came apart all at once. He was arrested that afternoon on charges of aggravated assault, criminal identity fraud, attempted financial fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. The investigation that followed uncovered the full extent of what he had planned, the years of obsession, the methodical research, the surgery he had undergone not once but in multiple stages across 14 months, the coordination with the driver who had been paid to cause the crash in that parking garage, the careful study of Elliot's habits and speech patterns and personal history. He had spent 2 years becoming my husband. He had spent another year waiting for the right moment. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I testified for 2 days. Scott did not testify in his own defense. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. He received a sense of life without the possibility of parole. I was in the hospital when my sister called to tell me the verdict. I was already there because Elliot had woken up 9 days earlier. It had been gradual. The doctors had warned me it might be disorienting, that he might not have clear memories of the night of the accident, that recovery from that kind of trauma takes months and sometimes years. What I remember is this. I was sitting in the chair beside his bed, and I was reading a magazine. I wasn't really reading, and I heard him say my name. Not honey, not sweetheart. Odd. I put the magazine down and I looked at him, and he was looking back at me with those eyes I had been missing for weeks without knowing quite how to name the missing. And I started crying before I even reached the side of the bed. I have thought a lot in the months since about what this experience did to me. Not just the fear of it or the grief of it, but the strange particular guilt of not knowing, of having lived alongside someone who had hurt the person I loved and not having seen it sooner. There are moments, even now, when I replay a conversation from those 3 weeks and I catch something I missed. A half-second pause, a wrong word, a gesture that was close but not quite right. But I've also had to make peace with the fact that what Scott did was extraordinarily premeditated. He had studied Elliot for years. He knew things I didn't know about my own husband because he had been paying attention in a way that was, in itself, a kind of violation. He had prepared for my doubt. He had prepared for my doubt. He had prepared for my doubt. He had engineered every interaction to feel like reassurance. I wasn't naive. I was deceived by someone who had made deception his entire purpose. Elliot came home 4 months after the accident. He walked through the front door on a Tuesday, and I had cleaned the whole house and made the dinner he always requested when he'd been traveling long. Roast chicken and those slightly too crispy potatoes he claims are his favorite. And when he came in and set down his bag and looked around at the house where another man had lived for 3 weeks, I watched him take a breath. "Thank you," he said. "Not for the dinner. Not for the clean house." I think he was thanking me for the part that came after. For not falling apart. For staying steady. For making sure that everything Scott had tried to take was still here when Elliot woke up to claim it. I held his face in my hands for a long time. His actual face. The one I had known for 6 years. People ask me sometimes what the strangest part of the whole experience was. And I always say the same thing. It wasn't finding out the truth. It wasn't the trial. It wasn't even the weeks of living inside the not knowing. The strangest part was the moment I drove home from the hospital that very first night at 3 a.m., with the image of that man in the hospital bed still fresh in my mind. And I walked through the front door, and the man waiting in the kitchen offered me tea, and for one small, disorienting moment, it felt like comfort. That's the part I think about when people say they would have known immediately. When they say they would have felt it, sensed it, never been fooled. Maybe some people would have. But grief and exhaustion and years of trust are powerful things. And a person who has spent 14 months becoming someone else, someone you love, they know exactly which shape comfort takes. I know now. And I never forgot again. I've thought a lot about what it means to be deceived by someone who studied you, not someone who guessed at you, not someone who made assumptions, but someone who watched and listened and cataloged and then used everything they learned to walk right through the front door of your life. Scott didn't just copy Elliot's face. He copied the weight of 6 years. The inside jokes, the small habits, the exact texture of an ordinary Tuesday night. And I think that's what I keep coming back to. Not the audacity of what he did, but the patience of it. 2 years of preparation, 14 months of surgery, all of it in service of a plan that only works if the person on the other end trusts completely. He was counting on my trust. And for 3 weeks, my trust held. I used to feel ashamed of that. I don't anymore. Because here's what I've come to understand. There is no version of love that doesn't involve vulnerability. When you love someone the way I loved Elliot, the ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday night kind of love, you stop auditing them. You stop looking for proof. That's not weakness. That's what trust actually is. And Scott didn't defeat my instincts. He exploited something real and good and human. The shame belongs to him, not to me. What I carry now instead is something different. A kind of hard-won clarity about the difference between intelligence and wisdom. I was not unintelligent during those 3 weeks. I noticed things. Small things, the wrong cabinet, the wrong word, the half-second pauses. My mind was working the whole time. But I kept overriding what I noticed because I didn't yet have the courage to believe something so enormous could be true. Wisdom, I think, is what happens when you finally stop letting comfort talk you out of what you already know. The moment I stopped doing that, the moment I sat in my sister's office and let the evidence mean what it meant, everything shifted. I didn't fall apart. I made a plan. I went home and made dinner and smiled across the table, and I did it again the next night and the night after that. And all the while, I was building something that would hold. That's not coldness. That's what it looks like when you decide that the person you love is worth fighting for, even when the fight requires you to be very, very still. Elliot calls me methodical. He means it as a compliment. I used to laugh it off. Now, I understand. It's one of the truest things anyone has ever said about me. And Scott, I think about what drove him too, sometimes. Not with sympathy, but with the kind of clarity that comes from having stood very close to something dangerous and survived it. He had everything he needed to build a real life. What he didn't have was the willingness to accept the life he'd actually been given, so he decided to take someone else's. And every choice that followed, the surgery, the planning, the cruelty of the staged accident, was the next logical step in a direction that had already gone wrong long before I ever met him. That's how it works, I think. Not in dramatic moments, but in small ones. In the quiet decision to want what someone else has instead of tending to what's yours. In the choice to deceive instead of earn. Each one small. Each one pointing somewhere. Elliot said my name when he woke up, and I was already crying before I reached his bedside. 8 months later, I still think about that moment more than any other. More than the arrest. More than the verdict. More than the sentencing. Just my name. The right one. From the right person. That was enough.